I come from a Mennonite family. My father was a Mennonite minister, and I think that that religious tradition has had a strong influence on my life. I've been privileged to study both in Germany and in the United States, and my teachers and friends in both Germany and the United States have had a strong influence on my life. I'd also like to express my gratitude to the late Andre Helligers, who had faith in a graduate student who was completing his dissertation on the history of the just war theory. I confessed to Andre when I interviewed at Georgetown that I had never had a formal course in medical ethics. And Andre's reply was, "That's fine, you can learn on the job." So I learned on the job during the next 39 years. My colleagues at the Kennedy Institute have been very supportive and helpful. I'll mention Tom Beecham specifically. We co-edited 8 editions of a bioethics anthology. And I'd also like to express my thanks to Doris Goldstein and my library colleagues who always kept us up to date and were willing to go the second mile to help us get any document on Earth. I spent 4 years at the Yale Graduate School from 1967 to 1971. James Gustafson was my dissertation supervisor. He's retired in the vicinity of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we have the opportunity to get together periodically when my wife Sue and I travel to New Mexico. He was a very important influence on my life. During my years at Yale, the Black Panther movement was quite prominent in discussions and in a huge demonstration in May of 1970. I served with one of the New Testament faculty members as a marshal during that demonstration. It could have easily gotten out of hand. I remember one moment when the demonstrators were about to jaywalk across the street from the Green to the front of the mayor's office, where riot police were arrayed in a phalanx, watching for any trouble. A very astute African-American policeman said to the demonstrators, "You better go down to the corner and cross at the light because some of these drivers would rather run over you than stop. They don't agree with what you're doing." Well, by the time the demonstrators got down to the stoplight and kind of waited for the walk signal, their ardor died down, and we never did have a confrontation during the day. On the Monday following that Saturday, Richard Nixon ordered the invasion of Cambodia by US troops. If that had happened over the weekend, I can't imagine what kind of trouble would have erupted. I don't recall ever having met Jay Katz. However, Alex Capron and I were both members of a small study group that was put together by David Duncombe, chaplain at the Yale Medical Center. So we got to know each other, and we studied especially ethical issues in human genetics during that time. And through visiting the Yale University bookstore, I noticed a huge stack of materials for the Yale law students put together by Alex Capron for Jay Katz. So I purchased a copy, even though I wasn't a Yale law student. And those materials went into the book that came out in 1972, Experimentation with Human Beings. So I feel as if I learned from Jay Katz, even though I didn't meet him or have a class with him. While I was at Yale, Paul Ramsey came to visit, and he gave several lectures. I think they were the Lyman Beecher lectures. Those lectures later went into his book, The Patient as Person, and also his book, Fabricated Man. So I was able to get a preview of Ramsey's books and to meet Paul. I remember his talking about how he looked to other people for raw material. I learned later that he was spending 2 spring semesters at Georgetown at the invitation of Andre Helligers. And that research that he was able to do, the conversations that he was able to have with faculty members at Georgetown is clearly reflected in the footnotes of Ramsey's books. So those lectures were my primary introduction to biomedical ethics before coming to Georgetown. I received and accepted a job offer from Andre Helligers to come to the Kennedy Institute in about May of 1971. So I had a couple of months remaining in New Haven before we moved to the Washington, D.C. area. And during that time, I thought, why not gather materials? I've confessed to Andre Helligers that I've never had a formal course in biomedical ethics. It's time to begin the remedial education now. So I did comb the Yale University Library, the Law School Library, and the Divinity School Library for materials that were relevant to the field of biomedical ethics. I continued that into the first months here at Georgetown, and in October of 1971, I put it all into what was called a core ethics library, which was basically a description of the books and articles that we either had or were trying to acquire for the bioethics library. So in October of 1971, we produced this core ethics library, as it was called, on an IBM Selectric typewriter. I think MagCard typewriters were just becoming available. So I said to Andre Helligers, well, we can update this every few months and we'll have a bibliography. And Andre, always the visionary, said, why just a bibliography? Why not an information system for bioethics? And I said, okay. Warren Reich had the same experience. He asked, maybe we could produce a dictionary of bioethics? And Andre said, why just a dictionary? Why not an encyclopedia? So that was the genesis. I wrote up a grant application in 1972, tried to find a niche within the federal government where we could submit the application. We landed on the National Library of Medicine, where 2 staff people, Richard West and Peter Klepper, were open to the idea. We submitted the application, and it was turned down. They gave us some suggestions. The review committee gave us suggestions for revision. Mr. Klepper and Mr. West said, this is a good project. Here we'll suggest a consultant who can help you with the information system for bioethics. David Batty came down from Canada to be our consultant, helped us to set up an information system. We submitted a revised proposal, which was really much better. Dan Clauser was a member of the review committee for that second proposal, and we were funded in 1974 and produced our first annual bibliography of bioethics in 1975. We then went on to submit bibliographic records to the National Library of Medicine, where they're available in the PubMed or Medline database. In the early stages of the Bioethics Information Project, we had to decide what terms to use in indexing documents. We had two excellent bibliographers with a great deal of training in developing index languages. So our technique, recommended by our consultant, David Batty, was to take a sample set of 250 documents, index them, using as much as possible the terms in the documents. And we came up with maybe 300 terms. We then eliminated duplicates. So we invented a few new terms, and we came up with a language of about 250 terms, which then became the core of the bioethics thesaurus, which we then used in indexing the literature of bioethics for the entire duration of the project.
I can't let a discussion of semantics and lexicography go unfinished without asking you whether you have a preference for or an opinion on the use of the word research subject versus research participant.
I prefer the notion of a research participant because it implies an active involvement by the human being who's involved in the study and an awareness of what the study is about. Henry Beecher's name loomed very large on that early list. Experimentation had a very broad definition at that time, and one of the articles on that early list was an essay by Karl Rahner entitled Experiment Mensch, or the human being as an experiment. That was really an essay about man's capability of engineering himself or herself and kind of guiding human evolution. It was quite a daring statement for a Catholic theologian at the time. Paul Ramsey had not written anything at that time on research involving human beings, but William Curran had. There were a few conferences that showed up in the late 60s, but the literature was only beginning. The Hastings Center had been founded in 1969, and Bob Veitch went to the Hastings Center in 1970. So he and Dan Callahan and Willard Galen were three of the pioneering figures there. We came a little bit later. We actually were able to begin because Andre Helligers was able to convince the Kennedy Foundation that what they had started by giving a grant to Paul Ramsey for his 2 spring semesters of research could be continued on a more ongoing basis by establishing a research institute. It was initially called the Joseph and Rose Kennedy Institute for the Study of Human Reproduction and Bioethics. And we had 3 components initially. We had a group of people in ethics. We had a group of people in demography or population research. And we had several interested scholars in the medical center who were called the Laboratory for Reproductive Biology. I think as time went on, the biology focus faded more into the background. We did work closely with the demography group for many years, and they, as social scientists, brought a helpful perspective to our work. I was the first senior research scholar brought on at the Kennedy Institute. I had a 3-year appointment in May of 71, so it would continue through 74. There was no regular academic position, certainly no appointment as an assistant professor, and no tenure track. It was for 3 years and no promises beyond that. Warren Reich joined in about September of that year and was a wonderful colleague at the Kennedy Institute. He later went on to edit the Encyclopedia of Bioethics. He was a distinguished Catholic moral theologian. We had visiting fellows during the early years. Richard McCormick came as one of our first visiting fellows, a distinguished Jesuit moral theologian. Charles Curran, a Catholic priest and a theologian at Catholic University, also came during those early years. So in the beginning, Warren Reich and I were the two longer-term scholars, but not very long-term. And visiting fellows really did a great deal of the academic work during those early years. Doris Goldstein then joined us in 1973 and continued as the head librarian for almost 40 years. I think anyone who reads about the Tuskegee syphilis study is appalled to see that men were followed in a study. It really wasn't an experiment in the strict sense of their being randomized to one arm or another. They were followed without their knowledge or consent for years. They had spinal taps, which are quite painful for research purposes. They were discouraged from enlisting in military service so that the researchers could continue to follow them. Even when penicillin became available, widely available, for the treatment of syphilis, this fact was not disclosed to them, perhaps in part so that the study wouldn't be tainted by the use of penicillin to treat their syphilis. I think it's a terrible chapter in the history of US public health. I was very grateful that Bill Clinton formally apologized to the surviving participants in that study and acknowledged in a very eloquent statement that this kind of study without consent and with risks for the sake of research alone on unconsented subjects should never occur again. The public knowledge about the Tuskegee syphilis study certainly was a major factor in bioethics discussions in the 1970s. I think one of the proximate reasons for the start of the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects was newspaper articles about research involving live fetuses that was being conducted in Scandinavia in particular. NIH denied that it was funding any such research or that it had funded such research. Andre Helligers had served on study sections, and he knew better. I won't say he gave documents to the press. I will say that he left documents in places where he knew the press would find them and could follow up with NIH, which eventually had to admit that it had indeed funded such research abroad. This became a huge issue in the US Congress, especially in the wake of the Roe versus Wade decision in January of 1973. So a kind of compromise to head off premature legislation on fetal research in the United States was to establish a study commission on the protection of human subjects. Walter Mondale had suggested this kind of study commission all the way back in 1968, so there was a history of congressional discussion about the possibility. In the end, with the help of Senator Kennedy, I think the the mandate of the commission was broadened so that it wasn't just about fetal research. It also was about the general ethical principles that should underlie research involving human beings. And over time, the commission then took on specific tasks like research involving children and research involving prisoners. The late Kenneth Ryan, an obstetrician gynecologist, was the chair of the National Commission. The two bioethicists were Al Johnson and Karen Lebax. Several of us were asked to provide papers on the fetal research topic, which was the first topic that the National Commission took up. Joseph Fletcher wrote a paper, Paul Ramsey wrote a paper, I wrote a paper. There were two different topics that the commission looked at in terms of fetal research. One was research involving pregnant women who had expressed a desire to have their pregnancies terminated. So what kind of drugs could be given to these women during the interim between their statement that they wanted to have an abortion, planned to have an abortion, and the actual time of the abortion? The other issue was what can be done to fetuses that are expelled from the mother's body but still have signs of life. There is an abortion procedure that's not used very often, but that's very similar to a cesarean section at the full term of pregnancy. It's called a hysterotomy. And sometimes fetuses would be delivered alive after this surgical procedure. The study that really created outrage was a study in which the title was research on what happens in the isolated perfused fetal head. So living fetuses were decapitated, and then tubes were hooked up to continue their lives for some time after they had been removed from the pregnant woman's body. The commission, and I think the consultants as well, felt that this kind of research was disrespectful to human fetuses, even though they were pre-viable. There was no chance that they would survive. They were too early in their development. But we felt that these fetuses had the form of a newborn infant, even though they were smaller, and that this kind of research was disrespectful. Other non-invasive types of studies we thought could be conducted if there were proper oversight and review of the studies. So, and on the question of what could be done with a pregnant woman between the time she said she planned to have an abortion and the abortion itself, we wanted to be very sure that nothing was done that would prevent her from changing her mind. Nothing would be done that would harm the fetus, and then if she decided against the abortion, the fetus would later develop to maturity, be born, and might have a disability because of the research that had been done. So I think there was quite a thoughtful discussion of the issues and a kind of middle-of-the-road conclusion that was reached by the National Commission that inspired a great deal of confidence in the commissioners and their work.
You also provided input into the ethical principles that underlie research involving human subjects and the work that ultimately led to the Belmont Report. And I'd very much like to hear about your experience with that part of the Commission's work.
Here, I think I contributed toward what the Commission did in the end, but I didn't go quite far enough. I identified some moral rules that I thought should be employed in considering any proposed research. One was that there should be excellent research design. Another was that there should be an appropriate risk-benefit ratio. Another was that there should be informed consent by the people who were being invited to participate. Another was that there should be some kind of equity or justice in the sharing of the benefits and burdens of research. We thought in the 70s mainly about the burdens of research. And so we were concerned that minority groups or prisoners or children not be pressed into research that really held out little prospect of benefit for them, or where in the case of children they might not be able to really consent to the research. What the commission did was actually go a level deeper, and they came up with 3 principles under which you can array these rules very easily. They came up with the principles of beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. So under beneficence, you can put good research design and an appropriate risk-benefit ratio. Under justice, you can put equity in the sharing of the risks of research. And under respect for persons, you can put the requirement of informed consent on the part of the participants. I do give the commissioners credit. In the ethics literature of that time, in philosophy, William Frankena had a widely used textbook on ethics, and he had clearly identified beneficence and justice as 2 important principles of all ethics. He did not really talk about respect for persons. The commissioners divided that into 2 parts, but one of the 2 parts was respect for the autonomy of persons. And that picked up on a theme from Immanuel Kant that I think was a really good addition to the general literature in philosophical ethics at that time. I'll say a word about the genesis of the Beecham-Childress book, Principles of Biomedical Ethics. We started in 1975 to have a short course for professionals on biomedical ethics. We initially called it the Total Immersion Course in Bioethics. That sounded a little bit like the Baptist religious tradition, so we eventually changed the name to Intensive Bioethics Course. The 40th course will be held in 2014. In the earliest incarnation of that course, Arthur Dyke, a theologian at Harvard Divinity School, and 2 of his graduate students came down from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Arthur gave the ethical theory lectures in the total immersion course in bioethics. Gradually, we decided maybe we can do that with our own faculty members, the theory part of the course. And so we invited Tom Beecham and Jim Childress to develop lectures on ethical theory. And those lectures gradually grew into the book, Principles of Biomedical Ethics. So first it was the spoken word, and then it became the written word. What Tom and Jim did was take the 3 principles from the Belmont report and increased them to 4. In so doing, they changed respect for persons to respect for the autonomy of persons. I think that that probably was a helpful move. It connects respect with Immanuel Kant and his moral philosophy. It also made very clear that when we're dealing with research involving children, we're not dealing with autonomy in the full sense. The National Commission had divided respect for persons into two parts: respect for the autonomy of adult persons and protection of children. I think protection of children falls more into the area of risks and benefits, and therefore beneficence. Tom and Jim think that there's a stronger moral obligation not to do harm than there is an obligation to do positive good for others. And I understand that, but I think in some ways it's simpler just to talk about three principles: beneficence having to do with benefits and harms, justice dealing with the allocation of benefits and harms, and respect for autonomy dealing primarily with the understanding and consent of the individuals taking part in the research. I think this is a useful framework. It's been discussed internationally. There's an almost 1,000-page book about the principles of biomedical ethics. If I had to suggest a fourth principle, I think it would be something like solidarity. And that would be an attempt to say that the context for all that we do in ethics is that we're all in this together as a human community. And so we're not isolated individuals making autonomous decisions. We come out of communities, we're responsible to communities, and what we do has an effect on our fellow human beings. Tom Beecham and Ruth Faden have really done important basic work on the history and theory of informed consent. And as I read them, there are really two components. The one is a cognitive component, that being informed means that you understand what's entailed in the study and what the risks and benefits to you might be and what the benefits to society might be from your participation in the research. And that implies an honest disclosure on the part of the would-be investigator to the potential subject, not covering up any of the literature or the evidence that exists to date. Once the research subject has that understanding, and that's not an easy process, the second step is an act of will. So it's not only cognitive, it's also a decision on the part of the potential subject that, yes, I understand what's being proposed and I want to participate in this study. So I think understanding and then a tangible expression of willingness. And it's not so important to me whether it's a written consent or an oral consent. What's important to me is that on the basis of an adequate understanding of the proposed study, the person does make a decision to participate. Tom Beecham and I talked to a book editor about 1976 about putting together an anthology. This is the first edition of Contemporary Issues in Bioethics, which came out in 1978. About 2 years before 78, an editor with the Dickinson Publishing Company, a small company, spoke with us about the possibility of creating such an anthology, and we agreed to do it. While we were working on it, a couple of other anthologies came out, including one by Samuel Gorovitz and edited by Samuel Gorovitz and Ruth Macklin. But we continued with our work. Research involving human beings was an important part of this first anthology. We had 2 chapters on the topic. The first one was about general issues in research involving human beings, like consent and risks and benefits. The second part was research involving specific groups of subjects. And there we dealt with fetal research, research involving children, and research involving prisoners. The general essays in our 1 chapter on research were quite theoretical. And as I look at the various editions of this textbook, it seems to me that we became more historical as time went along. So when we got to the 7th and 8th editions, for example, we had much more material on the Tuskegee syphilis study, on the atrocious studies that had been done on concentration camp inmates during the time of the Hitler regime. We also looked at the studies that had been done by the Japanese army on Chinese people, mainly involving infectious diseases. And we looked at the work of the Advisory Committee on the Human Radiation Experiments, and we reprinted their executive summary. So I would say over time, we decided that we should not only talk about theory and principles and rules, but also actual cases of the misuse of human beings in research. On balance, I think we're in a better place than we were in 1971 when I first became familiar with this field. I think local institutional review boards understand their roles better than they did at that time. They were quite new in the early 70s. And data monitoring committees play a very important role in many multi-center studies. I think members of data monitoring committees have become more sophisticated in dealing with complex risk-benefit questions, and biostatisticians play an important role in helping data monitoring committees with their work. I think there's still a great deal that needs to be done. Somehow, institutional review boards need to be given greater honor and visibility and even dignity, I think, in colleges and universities and in companies that do research. It shouldn't be an assignment that's given to the junior faculty members. It ought to be the best and most experienced clinicians who serve on institutional review boards. I think having an interdisciplinary group is essential for multiple perspectives. I think having public representatives on IRBs is also important. Where I think we're still falling short is that we don't have a central registry of all clinical trials that are being currently conducted. I think that's very important for people to have, to know what's being done both in the private sector and with public funding. And I also think that all studies, the results of all clinical trials, should be publicly disclosed, regardless of whether the trial turns out to be, quote, negative. That is, it doesn't prove what the sponsor intended to prove. It's only if we have all the data that a meta-analysis of all the studies on a particular topic a meta-analysis makes sense. If we only have the results of studies that turned out in a way that's positive for the intervention, then we get a one-sided picture. So I think there should be a time limit, perhaps a year, after the conclusion of every clinical study, that the data will be publicly disclosed and then made available to those who perform analyses of the results of a certain intervention. Just as there are ways to redact information in classified documents, I think there are ways to protect human subjects in research studies. Any identifiers of age or gender, or certainly names, could be removed. In essence, what I'm saying is that I think that the general public and scholars should have access to the kind of information that the Food and Drug Administration currently has. I think that this hiding of the data on grounds that it's proprietary business information is not a tenable argument. The reporting of serious adverse events in any clinical trial is a core moral obligation of the researchers. So if they don't do it, they're really falling short of doing their duties as researchers. We in the general public depend on their doing so. In the field of human gene transfer research, NIH was surprised and disappointed to find, after the death of Jesse Gelsinger, when they looked at research involving adenoviral vectors, that only between 5 and 6% of the serious adverse events in studies with those vectors had been reported in a timely way to NIH, when it was clearly in the guidelines that those events were to be reported. So it's part of the social contract of researchers, I think, with all of us, that they're going to let us know when a serious adverse event occurs. Sometimes it's hard to disentangle what's a result of the underlying condition in a sick patient. With healthy volunteers, there's generally not a question of where a serious adverse event originates. It's interesting to go back to the literature of the 1960s and 1970s. There was a concern about, quote, human genetic engineering and perhaps modifying human evolution in the late 60s and early 70s. But by about the mid-70s, things had calmed down so that the big issue was the possibility not of changing the human germline or affecting human evolution, but on using a genetic intervention to help someone overcome a disease. And Richard Roblin was one of the thoughtful people. He and Ted Friedman co-authored an essay on the ethics of human gene therapy that was published in the 1970s, a very thoughtful anticipation of what the issues might be. The issue came to public attention much more in 1980, when the Los Angeles Times broke the story that a researcher at UCLA, Martin Klein, had gone abroad after losing patience with his local institutional review board, and had performed a gene transfer study once in Israel and once in Italy. In each case, it was with a patient with a very serious disease, a beta-0 thalassemia, which is a very severe blood disease, much more serious than sickle cell anemia, which is also a blood disease. His premature attempt to do gene transfer in humans sparked a response from the bioethics community. French Anderson and John Fletcher wrote a critical response to his study. The President's Commission on Bioethics, which was in existence at that time, discussed Martin Klein's study in their report, Splicing Life. And gradually, the sense began to emerge that perhaps we needed some kind of national oversight of this field, that any local institution might really want to help its own researchers to go forward with this important new area and might therefore have a conflict of interest in reviewing the study. By the early 1980s, the NIH Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee was really running out of work. It had been set up in the 1970s to deal with the possibility that some recombinant organism would escape from the lab and do damage to the environment or to the population of a city. By the late 1970s, I think there was general agreement that those hazards were very small. What was happening in the early 80s was that companies were starting to scale up to use recombinant DNA techniques to produce drugs. They had to know exactly what they were doing. So again, it looked as if there were not significant risks to public health. The human gene transfer question came along right about that time. And so the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee at NIH said, in effect, we're willing to take on this new topic. We'll set up a subcommittee and try to develop some guidelines. So I was asked to chair a subcommittee of the NIH RAC. And we worked very hard. In 1984, we were worried that we wouldn't have these guidelines finished by the time the first formal proposal to do what was then called human gene therapy came into NIH. In 1985, we published the guidelines. They really are an application of the Belmont principles and the rules for ethical research to a new field, the field of recombinant DNA being introduced into human beings. We then waited till 1987 for a preclinical data document, a kind of mock proposal. In 1988, we reviewed and approved a gene marking study. And in 1990 came the first study by French Anderson and Michael Blaise to treat severe combined immunodeficiency in children. The study was reviewed and approved, and for the next few years, a few proposals trickled in each year. In 1995, the RAC undertook a kind of data management review, we called it. This was suggested by Bridget Leventhal, the late Bridget Leventhal at Johns Hopkins University. We wanted to see what kinds of diseases were involved in gene transfer studies, whether there had been any harms to participants in the studies, and whether there had been any success. We didn't see any major harms, but we also didn't see any clear success. In the one case with the children who had severe combined immunodeficiency, they stayed on their adjunctive therapy as well as receiving gene transfer. So it wasn't clear what the benefits were derived from. Well, about this time, Harold Varmus, the director of NIH, was receiving advice from two committees. One committee said the RAC really ought to focus only on studies that are novel. Another scientifically oriented panel said this whole field is not doing well, the researchers ought to return to the lab and just take a break from involving human beings because, as subjects, because it's not ready, it's not helping anyone. And early in '96, probably following up on his judgment that the field wasn't doing well, Harold Varmus proposed in a speech and then in the Federal Register to abolish the RAC. There was an outcry in the bioethics community for sure. Some people in the biomedical research community were also concerned, and members of Congress were concerned, and 4 members of Congress wrote to Harold Varmus expressing their concerns. The upshot was that Dr. Varmus backtracked somewhat, kept the name RAC, but changed its role so that the RAC no longer approved and disapproved protocols. It essentially became advisory to the Food and Drug Administration. So the responsible people at the Food and Drug Administration were happy to attend RAC meetings and hear public discussion by an interdisciplinary group of individual protocols, and they could take that discussion under advisement as they made their decisions whether to allow researchers to go forward under an investigational new drug application. I was concerned, even though I wasn't on the RAC, I was concerned that the field was becoming less visible to the public, even though the RAC did some really good studies of generic issues like germline genetic intervention during those years, and also prenatal gene transfer. They studied those issues. But the RAC really had lost its authority if it could no longer approve and disapprove studies. So all of us who had been tracking this field were saddened beyond measure when we learned in September 1999 that Jesse Gelsinger, an 18-year-old young man in reasonably good health, with a rare metabolic disorder that was being pretty well controlled with drugs and diet, had died in a gene transfer study at the University of Pennsylvania. The death of Jesse Gelsinger occasioned an agonizing reappraisal of the whole human gene transfer field. In December of 1999, there was a public meeting. The Food and Drug Administration accused the researchers at the University of Pennsylvania of several shortcomings in their study, of not disclosing data from animal studies in a timely fashion, and laid the blame on the researchers at the University of Pennsylvania. What we don't know is how carefully the Food and Drug Administration had been monitoring this study in the meantime, and how many people were involved in the monitoring work of the FDA for the gene transfer field. And that's because we can't see behind the closed doors of the Food and Drug Administration. I think as a result of Jesse Gelsinger's death, people came to appreciate that the RAC was performing an essential public role. I checked the NIH website recently, and the RAC continues to function. It meets quarterly. It reviews protocols. It's a distinguished group, And I think it's probably the best single example we have of national public oversight for one sphere of biomedical research. So I'm happy, not just for personal reasons, that Dr. Varmus's plans to scrap the RAC, to get rid of the RAC, did not work out. The RAC has played an important role then in monitoring what happened in other studies. In about 2002, there was great encouragement from a French study of gene transfer in children with severe combined immunodeficiency. The RAC certainly talked over that study with the researcher in France. We were then saddened to learn that some of the children in that study developed leukemias as a secondary effect of the gene transfer, and one of those children died. I'll never forget the day when I encountered Madison Powers outside the main university gate of Georgetown. He was on the RAC at that time, and he said to me, "Did you hear about the death of a child in a gene therapy study?" And I said, "No." And he said it was in the French study that looked so successful. And I said, "Oh no, Madison, that can't be true." At the end of that decade, 2010, the French researchers had gone ahead with two different forms of severe combined immunodeficiency. There's one form that affects only males and another form that can affect both males and females. And they had achieved very positive results. I think there were 5 leukemias in all as a secondary effect of the gene transfer, but only in the X-linked severe combined immunodeficiency. And there also has been a report of a successful treatment for an inherited retinal disease in a small number of patients. So a field that we hoped would succeed in 1990, or at least the early 1990s, finally, by 2014, is starting to have some positive effects on carefully selected target diseases. But human gene transfer studies are still really in their infancy, and I think the jury is still out on whether this will prove to be an important kind of biomedical intervention. Incidentally, I've switched back and forth between the phrase human gene transfer and human gene therapy. For years, we always talked about human gene therapy. And there are journals with human gene therapy in the title. But some researchers in the field, including Larry Churchill, have suggested that the phrase human gene therapy might in itself overpromise, and that human gene transfer is a more neutral term. They worried that when people were considering whether to participate in human gene transfer studies, they would see therapy in the title of the protocol and say, "Oh, this is going to be good for me," and they would stop thinking. So I think transfer is a neutral term, just like transplantation is. You don't know for sure whether a bone marrow transplant or an organ transplant will succeed. And similarly, you don't know whether gene transfer will be beneficial to the recipient.
Your recounting of Jesse Gelsinger's death called to mind the fact that the researcher in that case had not told the family or Jesse himself about the fact that he was a principal in the biotech company that would benefit if this gene transfer therapy was successful. And so the conflict of interest issues loomed large in that case. That in turn calls to mind Dr. Beecher's exhortation that a responsible, compassionate, and competent and informed, intelligent investigator was the best protection for a human subject. I'd like you to talk a bit, if you would, about the other lapses in the Jesse Gelsinger case and how we can persuade or oblige, and everything in between, investigators to focus more on ethical principles and on paying attention to not only the Belmont Report, but the many other codes and certainly regulations that govern their conduct.
The RAC did review the initial proposal that came from Dr. Wilson's University of Pennsylvania group at a public meeting. This was during the period when the RAC had almost been abolished, and I think the RAC was still in some ways reeling from that experience. But also what happened was that the clinical protocol from Penn went behind closed doors at FDA. There were changes made to the protocol that I think the RAC didn't know about. In addition, I think that the RAC and the office at NIH that staffed the RAC did not receive timely information about the progress of the study. There's some dispute about whether the Penn group submitted reports to the FDA in a timely fashion. There's also dispute about some studies in non-human primates and when the results of those studies were reported to the Food and Drug Administration. I think the Penn researchers asserted that the one study wasn't directly relevant to their study involving human gene transfer. But you've also raised the issue of potential conflicts of interest by investigators. I don't know what the Food and Drug Administration knew about the commercial background of Dr. Wilson's study. I'll just say as a general rule, I think it's essential when anyone is putting forward a human gene transfer study that they disclose any sponsorship by private firms, any involvement of the researchers in partial ownership of the firms, if that's the case. We had already run into a bit of pushback on the RAC about public reporting of serious adverse events before the Jesse Gelsinger tragedy, and I think that was in part because of commercial interests and a concern that reporting serious adverse events could affect a company's potential for attracting funding and other financial matters.
You have had your hand in considerable academic skills in almost every genetic-related and reproductive technology-related process and project in this country in the last 40 years, among them IVF. And I know that in 1978 you were appointed to an HEW, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare Ethics Advisory Board on IVF Research and Therapy. And I'd very much like to hear about your work with that advisory board and what the reported recommendations were from it.
In 1977, a researcher proposed to NIH in a research proposal to study the possibility of using in vitro fertilization as an infertility treatment. There were regulations at the time that said that the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, as it was called then, could only approve such a study if an ethics advisory board reviewed and approved it before it began. So early in 1978, Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Joseph Califano, appointed an ethics advisory board. James Gaither was the chair. Richard McCormick and Cecil Bach were two bioethicists on the panel. Charles McCarthy and Barbara Mishkin, two very good friends, were the principal staff people for the Ethics Advisory Board. In the spring of '78, the proposal by the researcher to do in vitro fertilization research was brought to the Ethics Advisory Board, and the board agreed to review it. Little could the board know that in the summer of 1978, Louise Brown would be born on July 25th. And so this issue that looked fairly abstract, an NIH research proposal, suddenly was in the public eye. So the Ethics Advisory Board had a context in which to do its work. The board worked very hard. John Biggers, a reproductive biologist at Harvard, conducted a worldwide survey of the literature on the field. He looked into what is the usual rate of loss in humans after fertilization occurs, and concluded that perhaps a third of all early embryos are lost sometimes before a woman knows that she's pregnant or could be tested for pregnancy, sometimes later on. But there was research, and then research on what had been done in non-human species on in vitro fertilization. By May 4th of 1979, the Ethics Advisory Board had completed its work. It agreed that research on early embryos not needed for reproduction, so leftover embryos, could be used in research, that it was not ethically unacceptable to do such research. And they also concluded that in carefully controlled circumstances, clinical in vitro fertilization could be offered to patients. The report went into Secretary Califano on May 4th, 1979. Unfortunately, there was some kind of disagreement between Secretary Califano and President Jimmy Carter before Secretary Califano could respond to the report. And no Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare ever responded to the Ethics Advisory Board report. It was a beautiful, well-documented report, and it just gathered dust on shelves. And it wasn't until the mid-1980s that the Warnock Committee in the United Kingdom produced its own report on human in vitro fertilization and embryo transfer, and got worldwide recognition for the beautiful report that they wrote and the analysis that they did. The Warnock Committee report is an excellent document, but this is a case where we had an excellent report in 1979, but the public policymakers were not ready to deal with the issue, and so they failed to confront it between 1979 and the mid-1980s. So it was discouraging to have done such hard work to produce a good report and then not have it become an integral part of public policy in the United States.
So much of the work you've done, both inside and outside the academy, has been at the interface of ethics and science and politics, perhaps none more so than your work on stem cell research when you advised President George Bush, the second George W. Bush, in 2001. And since I could only imagine what those meetings, conversations, and or other interactions must have been like, I'd be very grateful for whatever you can share, because if there ever was a political lightning rod, putting aside for now abortion, I'd very much like to hear about that experience.
In late 1998, James Thompson published the first paper about creating human embryonic stem cells in the laboratory. He was at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So that triggered a public discussion of the topic, and the question then arose, could NIH fund studies of human embryonic stem cell research? James Thompson had gotten his funding from private sources, from one major biotech firm in particular, and from a University of Wisconsin related foundation. So he didn't have NIH funding to do the work that created the human embryonic stem cells. When George W. Bush took office in early 2001, he decided to make human embryonic stem cell research one of his primary domestic issues. And for months, he and his advisors studied this issue with great care. I salute him and his staff for the careful work that they did. I think they had notebooks full of clippings about human embryonic stem cell research, the ethical arguments, pro and con, what was happening in the United Kingdom in this field. In July of that year, I only found this out later, President Bush invited Leon Kass and Daniel Callahan to come to the Oval Office and talk about the ethical issues surrounding this field of research with him. They talked for a long time, and at the end of the conversation, Leon Kass told me later, George Bush said, if I wanted to get a different point of view from yours, whom should I invite to talk? And my name was listed among several. In late July, my wife Sue and I were in Hilton Head, South Carolina on vacation. And Sally Schofield, the secretary of the Kennedy Institute, called and said, LeRoy, I hate to interrupt you on vacation, but Karl Rove just called, and I thought I should let you know that he called, and here's his number. So I called Karl Rove back, and he said, the president would like to talk to you about human embryonic stem cell research. And he has time on his calendar on Thursday from 5 to 5:30. And I said, well, my wife and I are on vacation in Hilton Head, South Carolina. Could we defer it till next week? And he said, no, the president's flying to Crawford, Texas, and on Saturday. And I wouldn't like to invite you there. It's not a very nice place. So I took that in stride, and I said, well, I'll see if I can get a flight back from Hilton Head to Washington, D.C. It was Monday or Tuesday. And if I can, I'll be glad to meet with the president. So I flew back, and as I often did for classes, I prepared a handout when I went to this visit. I first met with Karl Rove, and then we went into the Oval Office. Andrew Card, his chief of staff, was there, Karl Rove, one of the people who had been involved in coordinating the research on this topic was there. Karen Hughes was away, actually working on a speech for President Bush about stem cell research. So on my handout, I presented 3 options. The first would be that you would say no to human embryonic stem cell research and federal funding for the research. The second would be that you would say yes, but only for human embryonic stem cells that were left over, that were no longer needed by couples for reproduction. And the third would be that you would say yes to research involving human embryonic stem cells that had been created specifically for research. And then I went through what the various states in the United States were doing. Some states had moved forward in this field, for example, California. I said what various countries were doing in this field. And finally, the president said, well, what do you think I should do? What do you think I should decide? And I said, well, I hope you won't choose the first option. If you say no to human embryonic stem cell research, I think researchers will be very discouraged. And I think the families who have hope that this field will provide new paths to a possible therapy will also be very disappointed. So I hope you won't say no. I hope you will somehow say yes to this field of research. Well, then the staff asked really good questions. Are you talking about funding or are you talking about permitting? And I said, well, this is NIH. I think we're only talking about what an NIH funds, and there really was no discussion about the president trying to prohibit all stem cell research in the various states. And then they asked a question that really turned out to be critical. They said, what do you mean by human embryos that are already created? And I was taken aback, and I said, well, I mean, there are some embryos that are left over now, and in the future, other couples will decide that they don't need embryos for reproduction, and so there will be leftover embryos in the future. So we concluded the discussion. And I must say I was very impressed that President Bush was deeply engaged in the topic and very knowledgeable about the topic. And this was all about 2 months before September 11th. So this domestic question was front and center on his agenda. And when he flew to Crawford, Texas, he had no inkling that there would be an international terrorist incident 5 or 6 weeks down the road. Well, in a speech about a week after we met, George W. Bush really served as kind of a moral educator for the American public. He said that he was going to approve federal funding for human embryonic stem cell research, that only embryos that only embryonic stem cells that had been created by the time of his speech in August could be used. So there was a demarcation line. And I think that was kind of a moral issue in his view, but also it was politically astute because conservative religious groups could say to themselves, well, The embryos that were used to create these stem cell lines have already been dismantled and destroyed. So no additional harm is going to be done to human embryos in the future. So while we don't like stem cell research, at least this is better than it could have been. The president and his advisors assured the research community that there were plenty of human embryonic stem cell lines available. And that turned out to be the difficulty with the policy, which seemed morally and politically astute. It turned out that some of the stem cell lines that existed did not grow well. It turned out that the number was much lower than some people at the National Institutes of Health had estimated. They had probably been overly optimistic. So in the long run, this policy really meant that very little research was done with human embryonic stem cells with NIH funding. When researchers submit research proposals to the National Institutes of Health, we can count on a group of peer reviewers who are really expert in their fields doing the review. And even though they don't specifically have an ethical role or responsibility, in point of fact, many times they will detect flaws in research design or some aspect of a study that might escape the detection of a local institutional review board. So they're a kind of check, a kind of safeguard for any human participants in research. When research is done that answers only to the Food and Drug Administration, there is not even that degree of public involvement in the review process. And I'm concerned that we don't have the same kind of safeguards built in with commercially funded research that we do with publicly funded research. Perhaps the Food and Drug Administration needs to think through how it can upgrade its ethical review of the many thousands of research proposals, applications for investigational new drugs or devices that it receives each year. I am concerned that there's not an expert peer group that's external to the local institution that necessarily reviews proposals that only go to the Food and Drug Administration and not to the NIH or another federal agency. In 1994, a study demonstrated clearly that AZT given to pregnant women during the second and third trimesters of pregnancy could reduce and in many cases prevent the transmission of HIV infection to the fetus and the newborn infant. It was given both during pregnancy and after the birth of the infant to the infant. This study involved the intravenous infusion of AZT. The question came up, could a similar study be done in another country that might not have access to intravenous techniques for the treatment of pregnant women? The NIH and the CDC agreed to do a study, a placebo-controlled study in Thailand. And the rationale was that you don't have facilities for administering intravenous drugs in Thailand. So we're going to give a dose of AZT to the pregnant woman when she comes in for labor and delivery, and a dose of AZT to the newborn infant in one group, and we're going to give placebo to the other group. I missed one meeting of the Data Monitoring Committee where this study was discussed. And when I went to the next meeting, I raised questions about the study. And I was told, you're too late, number one, but you're also mistaken. This needs to be a placebo-controlled study, because otherwise we won't know how much better AZT is, if it's at all better than placebo. What I didn't know at the time is that researchers from Harvard had had a discussion with NIH about the funding of a study of AZT in pregnant women, also in Thailand. The Harvard group took the position that it would be unethical to have a placebo group. So they divided the women into 4 groups, and they said short, long, that is short on the pregnant woman, long on the infant, long, short, 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 or long, long. But everybody got the AZT. They had no placebo group, and early on in their study, they found that the short, short group was doing much worse than the other 3 groups, and they stopped that arm. The NIH and CDC carried forward their study with a placebo group. I felt very uncomfortable about this study during its conduct. I was relieved when the study stopped. It did show definitively that AZT during labor and delivery and for the newborn infant was better than placebo. But this was one case where I thought scientific considerations overrode ethical considerations. As one member of a data monitoring committee, you don't always win. And I've always been sad that a placebo-controlled study was done. The Data Monitoring Committee for the Women's Health Initiative clinical trial met for about 11 straight years, so it was a long trial. This was a trial with postmenopausal women in which some women received placebo, and women who had not had a hysterectomy received progesterone and estrogen. Women who had had a hysterectomy received estrogen. In this trial, things began to look quite negative for both groups on certain endpoints. And the Data Monitoring Committee was not quite sure what to do. We did something quite unusual in the middle of that study. We recommended to the director of the sponsoring institute, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, that he send a letter to all the investigators to be sent on to the women, informing them in the middle of the study that the Data Monitoring Committee had noted an excess number of thrombolytic events, like strokes, in the treatment groups thus far. The director of that institute was reluctant to do it. The first version of the letter said, the committee's concerned about this, but the difference might disappear. We said, that isn't what we asked you to say to the women. And so a second letter went out just saying there's an excess number of thrombolytic events in the treatment groups. We didn't know what would happen. Would the women drop out? Very few women dropped out of the study, even after having been informed of this fact. So that broke new ground, I think, for data monitoring committees. You can inform people in the midst of a trial of adverse events that you're seeing, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the trial will collapse. In the case of the one arm, we were not sure when to stop the study in terms of the second arm with women who had had a hysterectomy. We debated long and hard. We felt that the women were not being helped, and in fact, on a net basis, some women were being harmed. We had some split votes, 5-4 votes, about whether to continue the trial. And I was privately at the point where if the study was not stopped, I was going to resign from the data monitoring committee. It was the only thing that I could do as an individual on the committee. But just at that point, the sponsoring institute, in consultation with the NIH director, did stop the study. So I think data monitoring committees play an important role, and I think each person has to live with his or her own conscience in participating in such committees.
Thank you, Professor Walters. This has been an extraordinary journey for me. Really feel very privileged. Thank you for everything you've done for this field since its founding, and for informing, inspiring, and certainly being a true North Star for so many of us through your variety of pursuits. Thank you as well for bringing the first bibliography you assembled on that Selectric typewriter and the first issue of your Library Issues in Bioethics. I very much hope it gets it done again, but I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful questions.